One of the most common questions people have about Bart Starr is why did Lombardi take so long to pick him as his permanent starting quarterback? Before we get to that, though, let's do a little bit of backtracking and cover the man who initially had a starting nod, Lamar McCann. McCann came out of the University of Arkansas, where he was drafted by the Chicago Cardinals as the second overall pick in the 1954 NFL Draft. Here, you could view him as a type of diamond in the rough. As well as college team finished with a record of 3-7, McCann put up some decent numbers for his senior year, where he completed 78 of 150 passes for 1,107 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. That would put his completions at 52% in an era where it was common for quarterbacks to routinely dip below 50. And 8 touchdowns to 11 interceptions wasn't the bad stat it is now. This was something coaches could work with. Yes, McCann had a terrible TD ratio in his first 2 college seasons, where he threw a combined total of 11 touchdowns and 31 interceptions. That was poor even in that era. However, he improved a lot as a senior, and that must have impressed the Chicago Cardinals. The Cardinals had previously posted a terrible 1-10-1 record in 1953, and they were in the process of rebuilding, and now McCann was going to be the centerpiece for this. Unfortunately, he was not able to keep up a high completion percentage while in the pro ranks, and his touchdown to interception ratio became bad again, but there were a couple of bright spots on the team, such as running back Ollie Matson and receiver Don Stonecipher. The team would slowly improve, though, and the high point was 1956, where they posted a 7-5 record. McCann would pass for 1,159 yards with 10 touchdowns to 8 interceptions, and they even beat the eventual NFL champion New York Giants during the regular season, although New York would win the rematch. But this was the age where only the winners of the East and West would normally be in the playoffs, unless a tiebreaker was necessary, and with the Giants being multiple games ahead of them, they would have to stay home. The team would unravel after that, going 3-9 in 1957 and 2-9-1 the following year. McCann, to his credit, put up numbers that were respectable, although he was still having trouble with his completion percentage. In 1959, after 5 years and only 1 winning season, the Cardinals wanted to go in a different direction, so now McCann would be in Green Bay, arriving as a quarterback with some talent, although he was rough around the edges. So now let's get back to the question of what took so long for Bart Starr to supplant McCann. Well, one reason frequently listed is that Starr didn't win a single game as a starter until the second half of 1959, and he was in his 4th year in the league. 4 seasons and not a single victory until 59. Even the Green Bay Packers official historian Cliff Crystal, who is amazing at fact-checking, said this. However, if you go to Pro Football Reference, it shows Starr winning 3 games as a starter in 1957. So, who is right? Well, in November of 2023, Crystal made a new post that confirmed that Starr did indeed have 3 wins in 1957. But all of these would come with addendums. For example, with the Pittsburgh game, Crystal wrote, Starr was pulled at the end of the first quarter following an interception. In the Colts game, Crystal said Starr wasn't on the field when the Packers scored all 3 other fourth quarter touchdowns. And in the Steelers match, Crystal mentioned Pirelli ran for a touchdown and played the fourth quarter. Crystal concluded, in essence, if not for Pirelli bailing him out, Starr was winless after 19 starts over his first 3 seasons. If you want a little bit more elaboration and fact-checking, you can go to the PackersHistory.net website. There, it shows a screen capture of the starting lineups taken from the Green Bay Press-Gazette. In that September 29th win, Starr's name is listed first in the lineup before quarterback Babe Pirelli. And in the game against the Colts, you see the same thing. And finally, you have the same result against the Steelers. So this is confirmation that Crystal was right, and he did start those games. But once again, those wins for Starr were mostly just on paper. You have to remember that when someone is listed as a starter, all that technically means is that the player was on offense or defense for the opening offensive or defensive drive. That's it. The player could have come out of the game very early, and yet they would still get listed as a starter. And during this time period, some quarterbacks were used this way. For example, the New York Giants would sometimes use Don Heinrich at the beginning of the game, but then he would come out and Charlie Connerly would play the rest. So when you look at the number of quarterback starts and wins during this time period for the NFL in general, you can't take everything at face value. Okay, so prior to 1959, Starr had never been the number one factor behind a Packers victory. That's one reason for Lombardi to be indecisive about him, but what were the other reasons? For one, Starr didn't have a rocket arm, and he wasn't as athletic as some of the other quarterbacks. Instead, his strength lay with his decision-making. In 1959, for example, Starr completed the year with an interception percentage of 5.2. Using modern standards, that's not very good at all, but once again, passing stats like money have a type of inflation to them, and in the case of interceptions, it's a deflation. Well, McCann's interception percentage was 8.3, more than 3 points higher. Maybe Starr was just checking down all the time and throwing shorter passes. No, the data doesn't suggest that. McCann's average yards per attempt was 7.5, while Starr's was 7.3. On the field, that translates to less than the length of a football, so statistically speaking, he was probably throwing the ball just as deep as McCann, but with a higher completion percentage, and he was much less likely to turn the ball over. But Starr had limited playing time in 1958, so there wasn't that much for Lombardi to see when studying the game films, and the year prior, while Lombardi did see Starr in action when the Packers played against his Giants, this exposure was limited. For example, in Lombardi's own writings, he made zero mention of looking at any of the Packers' videos before 1958. So Lombardi was coming into his first year somewhat ignorant of Starr, or at least ignorant when compared to modern standards. And Starr had the type of talent that can easily be hidden. Someone has a strong arm, you can find that out in 2 seconds. Someone is super fast, same thing. Someone is a field general with a high completion percentage and doesn't throw a lot of interceptions. If you don't have a lot of film or data on the person, then the next quickest way to discover this is to hold a scrimmage in practice and give the quarterback a long amount of playing time to avoid sampling error. Under good conditions, a month could pass before you know, because a quarterback has to share practice time with multiple other QBs who also need plenty of minutes. And keep in mind the Packers start at camp with 5 total quarterbacks. 5. And sometimes when people do get playing time, they can get off to uncharacteristically bad starts. Hits my comment on sampling error. For example, when training camp began, one of the first things that Lombardi saw out of Starr was an interception. So like I said, it took some time. But why did it take as long as it did? Well, that takes us to 1960, and I will cover that in a separate documentary, but it involves McCann and an incident where he mouthed off at Lombardi. In another one of my videos, a commenter asked this question, and we both pulled up that story at about the same time, so yes, I am aware of this, and I have Bart Starr's own personal account of what went down, but to avoid repeating myself, I'm going to save the details for later. However, the on-the-field answer is that both Starr and McCann showed inconsistency, and as I mentioned before, right after McCann had apparently ruined his career in Green Bay in 1960, Bart Starr would play the Colts and throw 4 interceptions. So yes, both quarterbacks could have their own issues. Getting back to 1959, Lamar McCann was now hurt as the 3-3 Green Bay Packers headed into the rematch against the Chicago Bears. However, he would still play until a second injury right before halftime would sideline him again, leading an opening for Starr to finally come in and show what he could do. So let's get to the newspaper accounts. November 9th. The paper sarcastically led with the headline, Gracious Packers hand Bears 28-17 victory. So why gracious? This is in reference to two costly fumbles with the Packers that immediately put the Bears in scoring range both times. To start things off, Green Bay won the coin toss, and on the first offensive play, Horning picked up 3 yards, but it didn't count as they were offsides. On the next play, Horning fumbled, and the Bears recovered at the Packers' 12. This was followed by a 5-yard touchdown run by Merrill Douglas to give Chicago a 7-0 lead. Oh, and on that touchdown run, it was noted Ray Nitschke was one of the defensive players that was run over, so he was getting some defensive playing time, at least there. On the next drive, Jimmy Taylor picked up 11 yards and 2 runs. McGee dropped a pass in tight coverage, but then caught a 24-yarder. However, illegal use of hands was called, killing that play, so the Packers punted. The Bears then threw an interception to Tom Bettis on the Packers' 34. Taylor then ran it for 10. Then Horning fumbled again, and this time Chicago was gifted it at the Green Bay 35. Bertowski completed 2 screen passes to Caceres for a total of 17. Dooley caught a pass for 11 yards, and this was followed by a 5-yard Caceres rush to build the lead. McCann, however, was able to take them on 2 scoring drives. On 3 runs, Taylor and McElhaney gained a total of 16 yards to get to the 50. On second down, McCann threw to McElhaney, who took it to the Bears' 20. McElhaney ran for 7, then Taylor picked up 3 to take it to the Chicago 10-yard line. This was followed by another carry by Taylor for the score. Then Lou Carpenter returned a punt 51 yards to take it to the Bears' 25. The Packers were only able to make it to the 20, so they settled for a 27-yard Horning field goal. The Bears then went 78 yards for their score to widen the lead. This was aided by an interference penalty where Chicago pass was batted away, so instead of the Bears having to punt, they now had a first down at midfield. Art Daly himself called the penalty ridiculous, but he didn't elaborate on why. Chicago quarterback Ed Brown then threw a 36-yard strike to Harlan Hill. Right before the half, Lamar McCann hit Boyd Dowler for a 22-yard connection. However, on that play, McCann's cleat got stuck on the field, and he ended up pulling a muscle in his leg, causing him to leave the game 21 seconds before halftime. McCann would elaborate on this after the game. It was a freak. I was throwing the ball and Atkins hit me, but not very hard. I don't think he even knocked me off my feet. My cleats hung on the ground when he hit me and pulled all the muscles in the back of my leg. It was a freak accident. Outside of a little pulled muscle I had in the first Bears game at Green Bay, I've had one since I left college 6 years ago. Enter Bart Starr. No scoring would take place on that drive, and the half would end with the Bears on top 21-10. Despite the lack of scoring, Starr would engineer 2 drives that could have given them touchdowns, including a 58-yard drive where Starr took it to the 1, followed by a 50-yard drive where they got it to the Bears' 5. The Bears weren't able to do much in the second half either until the start of the fourth quarter, where they had a 9-play, 68-yard march. Most of that came from Berkowski running for 42 yards. The drive culminated in an 8-yard touchdown pass from Berkowski to Dooley. In the final period, on fourth down, Starr threw to Max McGee. However, he wasn't able to hold on for the touchdown. Late in the game, Billy Butler took a punt at the Packers' 39, and he was able to race down the sideline to finally give Green Bay their first and only score of the second half with 27 seconds left. Once again, this game was full of what-ifs. What if Horning hadn't lost 2 fumbles in the first quarter that put the Bears deep in Packers territory? What if they had scored touchdowns on those 2 red zone Bart Starr drives? Lombardi himself said, "I thought we were the better football team. We should have won the ball game. In fact, we should have scored at least 35 points." Lombardi mentioned the defensive performance. The defense played a very adequate game. The Bears had only that one drive near the end. That was all they did in the second half. But we make too many errors offensively. That's what's been beating us. Even when we've won, we've made too many errors. Starr, for example, had at least 3 passes dropped today. We've won 3, and we could have won 6 or 7. Jerry Kramer, frustrated at the failed red zone drives, threw some tape to the ground and said, "I can't understand it. We've never had any trouble down there before." In the passing department, they would have these stats. Lamar McCann would go 2 out of 5 for 52 yards, no touchdowns, and an interception. And Bart Starr would do this: 3 out of 10 for 20 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. And Jimmy Taylor picked up this: 90 yards and 22 carries and a touchdown. For receptions, Boyd Dowler would have 40 yards and 2 catches. In his book, Starr would call his performance disappointing. In a Hollywood movie, his first time on the field during the regular season would be a dazzling display that would surprise the fans, but in real life, sometimes the actual story is more mundane. However, it was an important milestone because Lombardi could have gone back to Joe Francis, but he didn't. He was curious about Starr, and he wanted to see more. November 10th. The paper talked about the 2 failed red zone drives that Starr led his team on and their inability to score despite being right by the goal line. Lombardi ruminated. "It wasn't the question of the play down there. We just didn't block in the goal line." He went on, "We didn't have the punch down there." On Bart Starr, Lombardi said his performance was fine. His play calling was good, and it certainly was not his fault. It's important to note that while Starr completed only 3 out of 10 passes, he protected the ball well, as there were no turnovers on his watch, and one of his throws should have been a touchdown, but McGee couldn't hold on. To some, it may be surprising that Lombardi said, "We played our best game Sunday, better than the 3 we won. We made errors in those wins, but we were lucky enough to get by. But this was a frustrating game, really a shame. This would have made our ball club, being behind and then coming back and winning as we should have done." And their next game looked like it might be yet another loss, as they would have a rematch against the Baltimore Colts, the defending champions, who had already beaten the Packers earlier in the year. November 11th. On the Wednesday of that week, it was mentioned that Lombardi was still waiting to see how McCann would recover from his leg injury. He hoped to get more information by Thursday or Friday. November 12th. It was noted that the Colts themselves had lost their last 2 games, so perhaps the Packers would have a shot and a chance to get things back on track. McCann was looking good in practice, but most of the actual passing was being handled by Starr and Francis, and again the question was how McCann's leg would fare if he had to play a full game. November 13th. 4 or 5 inches of snow were draping the city of Milwaukee, the site of the Packers' next match, and the cold weather probably wouldn't lead to anything melting before the game, which made Art Daly wonder if this was going to be a snow bowl. Due to the lack of good traction, Lombardi ordered his team to abandon their cleats and switch to sneakers. The Packers again used the arena for some indoor practice. An icy field was especially bad for McCann because his leg injury already gave him some issues with footing. Lombardi said they might wait until the pregame warm-up to decide if he would play McCann, but if he couldn't go, Starr would be his number 2 quarterback. November 14th. The Colts were picked as 9.5-point favorites over Green Bay. Starr's last game against the Colts in 1958 must have been on Baltimore's mind, as he led the Pack to a 17-0 lead over them before the Colts mounted the comeback and won 24-17. Both teams said, depending on the conditions in the field, they might switch to sneakers for the game. And Colts quarterback Johnny Unitas, who had an off game in a loss to the Redskins, was not expected to do that twice in a row, so the Packers were going to have to get ready. So Lombardi wasn't going back to Francis. Instead, Bart Starr was now his official number 2 man. Despite the loss, despite the underwhelming performance, Lombardi didn't blame Starr. From this point forward, he would never be his third stringer again. That's all for now. See you next time.